good evening and welcome to Merit Watch tonight. My name is David Craig. Hope you're enjoying the long weekend. Happy Victoria Day. I'm really excited about today's episode as we're going to be connecting with two different people. We're going to be connecting with David Haskell, who's a professor out of Wilfrid Laurier University, as well as Elie Cantin-Nantel, who is a correspondent in Ottawa for The Hub Canada, as well as journalist and columnist. I want to explore the difference in demographics in Canada in regards to the most recent election that we just had. There is a lot of sentiment going around about the boomer generation and older generation that is voting for Liberals because they are concerned about a potential threat, which is not a threat, but they perceive the threat as Donald Trump in terms of the sovereignty of Canada, the assets, the economy, tariff wars, all those things that would threat their individual potential wealth. But also we notice a giant shift in the younger demographic of an emerging generation in Gen Zs from 18 to 24, even people aged 30 and under, who have massively been shifting towards conservatism. Now, don't get that confused with the Conservative Party, although the polls did show us there was a big shift in younger demographics towards the Conservative Party. But I want to explore the reason why are we seeing young people moving to this idea of conservatism, a political philosophy that emphasizes differences than what liberal or what ideologies might be following on the liberal side of things. So we're going to explore as we get two guys who have been following this for a while. We've been seeing a large difference as well, an uptick in church attendance from young people who are pursuing purpose in their life. They're pursuing different reasons as to what they think, what influences how they vote, also direction they're going. So I'm excited to be able to talk to a couple of people today to look at this because the pendulum always swings, and we are seeing a swing culturally, but also politically as an emerging generation as now leaning towards a different type of party than they traditionally did. So stick with us. We'll be back right after this break. Well, welcome back to Merit Watch tonight. I am joined by Elie Cantin-Nantel. It's great to have you with us, auto correspondent for The Hub, journalist and columnist. Hey, thank you for joining me today.
My pleasure, David.
I want to get into a little bit of a reflection regarding the election that happened, not to rhyme, I just did, but several weeks ago with Liberals and Prime Minister Mark Carney taking a minority government. But I want to focus a bit on some of the data that we have seen through the election in terms of polling, but also voter turnout, specifically demographics. You've written several pieces, which I highly recommend people to go take a look at as you've explored the breakdown of demographics and a bit of a shift of what's been happening, especially over the last maybe 4 to 5 years. My question for you, just maybe to lead us off, is tell us, first of all, what did you observe during the election when it comes to a boomer generation versus an emerging generation of Gen Zs that might be 18 to 24? Where did their votes lie? Where were they leaning? And take us through maybe that from top down.
Absolutely. Well, there's a well-known quote, and it reads, if you're not a liberal at 20, you have no heart. If you're not a conservative at 40, you have no brain. But what we saw in the last federal election, David, was the complete opposite of that. So while in previous elections, you had the older people vote conservative and the younger people vote for progressive parties like the Liberal Party and the NDP, this time it was the opposite. So I have the last Nanos poll done right before the election. And with 18 to 34, 41% conservative, 32% liberal, 55 plus, 52% liberal, 34% conservative. The reason for this was very well, there's two factors. The boomer vote is very in the context. It was Donald Trump. It was the number one issue for the baby boomers. And the reason for that is that these people have assets. 75% of people in that age group own homes. A lot of them have investments and stuff like that. So tariffs put that at risk. Meanwhile, you have Gen Z. And the frustration existed before Trump, and that is that they have nothing because the price of a house has increased so much that in Toronto and in Vancouver, you now need to make $200,000 to buy a home. Most people are stuck with roommates or with their parents because even rents have gone out of control. So they don't have that same level of concern about Trump, or even, unfortunately, as I explored in another piece I did for The Hub, the same level of patriotism, because they look at Canada as a place that doesn't really offer them as many opportunities anymore. But Pierre Poilievre was the one who best tapped into that right from the start. Even when he was running for the leadership of the party, he was talking about those young people stuck in their parents' basements because they can't afford homes. And he kept on talking about that, the pocketbook issues through the elections. And I think that played a part in the results that we saw, where the Carney campaign focused on Trump, got the boomer vote. The younger people stuck around with Poilievre because of that.
So when it comes to the threat that the Liberals and Mark Carney focused on, which was this anti-Trump sentiment, and we saw that with elbows up, and we saw a lot of Canada, especially businesses, start to all of a sudden wear Canadian pride in the front of their stores or in their advertising and promotions. So you're suggesting or saying that this really did not affect younger generation in terms of an overall threat, or are you saying the other issues? And what are those other issues that they're dealing with? Basically made it not a giant threat for them.
Well, I think there was some polling done that showed that there's low levels of patriotism among Gen Z. Part of that I attribute to the education system, which has been teaching that Canada is an evil country, that Canada is racist, etc. That impacts patriotism. You have Gen Z being the most multicultural generation, so you have people that are quite new to Canada, so they may not have the same kind of deep roots to Canada as someone who has been here for a couple of generations. But you also have the fact that it's hard, David, to feel patriotic about your country if your country isn't willing to offer you anything. I think a lot of young people today look at Canada, they look at the job market, the housing prices, inflation, and they just don't feel positive about what that has to offer. So you were asking me about some of these other issues. I think the biggest issue for Gen Z was pocketbook issues. The fact that housing is so expensive. A Honda Civic today has basically doubled since 2015. The car, like basic necessities, have become luxuries, and I think that for a lot of young people, it frustrates them. There was a poll, 68% of young people don't think they're better off than their parents. And I think a lot of people took those emotions when they went to the voting booth.
Yeah, I think that's an honest outlook and a good outlook on it. And in my opinion, when it comes down to specifically this election and most elections, the economy should be the number one thing in terms of what are we doing, what are we preparing for future generations. Young emerging generations are obviously very concerned about, are they going to be able to build a future? Are they going to be able to achieve the things that their grandparents have achieved? Because if you look at the time frame the grandparents were here, the boomers, is that there's a time when Canada was moving forward and it was progressing, and they were able to buy assets, they were able to grow, build a life. And now that outlook has been not dismissed, but it's been it's not as positive looking forward because of the economic decline. And I really think you're picking up on here is that young people, and we've seen this on our programs that we're doing, the amount of young people that are reaching out, wanting to connect and talk about their outlook, is that they just don't feel like the environment is here for where they can thrive. It's just about surviving from time to time. So that's a very interesting outlook. I want to ask you just a question because the Conservatives did focus on youth. They focused on, and they obviously won that young vote, whereas the Liberals won the older vote. But in some of your pieces, I believe, and from what I've seen on X as well, you've been a little bit critical of the conservative media campaign that they had in terms of the lack of what they've done, and maybe talk a little bit about what you think the Conservatives could have done better in wake of the election now.
Yes, for sure. So I wrote a piece and I borrowed one of Poilievre's favorite slogans, axe the tax. And instead I said, well, axe the media strategy, because the media strategy, David, for the Conservative Party was to be very skeptical, very hostile to a certain degree with legacy media. And I think there's merit to be skeptical or to be weary of mainstream or legacy media like the CBC, given that they have a history of being biased against conservatives and biased against small c conservative causes and movements. That said, they extended that same, well, first of all, I think they took that anti-legacy media approach a little too far, but more consequentially, they extended that approach to independent media. So like myself, for example, I consider myself a small c conservative. In another life, I actually used to work as a conservative staffer. Now today, I don't have any political party memberships because I prefer analyzing the news. But I was not allowed to ask questions. I was also put in a little pen with the journalist. We weren't allowed to interview rally attendees and rallies,
Hmm.
and we weren't allowed on the plane. And I think that was a mistake.
Yeah.
I think conservatives need to talk to as many people as possible, get their message out as much as possible, do as many podcasts as possible, including American podcasts. I do think he should have gone on Joe Rogan. I do think he should have done Megyn Kelly, Ben Shapiro, these podcasts. Instead, they didn't. And reach people, more young people. I always think they'll say, "Oh, well, they did well with young people." I think they could have always done better. You can always do better, David. They could have done that, done some podcasts that are more popular with older folks. I think that was quite a missed opportunity that they did. They should have embraced new media the way that Donald Trump did in the U.S. by going on Dr. Phil, going on Megyn Kelly, doing Theo Vaughn, doing the Nelk Boys. He did a range. He didn't just do one type. He did a
Yeah.
range of new independent voices. And I was hoping that Polyev would do the same. Instead, he didn't, unfortunately.
Yeah, that it's an interesting in hindsight, it's interesting to look at the strategy because I think at the time they were trying not to associate with America or Trump as much as they could. And I agree with you. I think it was a miscalculation. I think there was an opportunity to actually not there's an opportunity there to actually come out really strong and show that, we're going to build and forge relationships. We're not afraid of this America conflict, but trying to distance yourself. I think obviously hindsight's always 2020. We can find out what's going on. We only got about 1 minute left. I want to ask you just a real quick question because I was reading a study the other day that came out of the UK talking about young men and the rise of church attendance in the UK. It's jumped from about 4% to 16%, which is shifting a little bit this idea of young people moving to this idea of conservatism. We've talked a little bit about the economics. We've talked about some of that aspect. Is there a cultural reason, whether maybe we're on the falling away from the side of maybe some woke ideologies that's been coming out where young men and women have felt maybe different social pressures? Do you think that's had any influence in terms of this move towards conservatism with a young emerging generation, or is it strictly economical?
No, it's not strictly economical. I think in Canada, the economics has been a big factor. But I wrote in Piece for the Hub when I was explaining why young people are turning to Polyev. I said it's not just economics. There's two factors. The other factor is the cultural factor. We are seeing conservatism, David, become counter-cultural
Yeah. Okay.
amidst the left, especially in this century and in the especially the back last half of last century, becoming controlling of everything. The narratives coming out that are kind of demonizing men, saying that, toxic masculinity. You look at ads like Gillette putting, ads that I thought were, male bashing, basically. And I think a lot of young men have grown to be quite frustrated
Yeah.
with this, to be honest. The religious part is just another aspect of that. We've become increasingly secularized. So therefore, the countercultural thing to do is go to church. And I have a bit of personal experience there. I became a Christian when I was 16 years old. I started going to church when I was 16 years old, and I grew up in a secular family. And it did feel rebellious, but I also think, more importantly, it feels real. Like life has become so meaningless in this culture that is so focused on superficial things, that is so focused on material things. It feels good. It actually feels purposeful. It feels good to go to church. And I'm sure as we become more and more secularized, there are more young people that are actually seeing this place as, wow, this is somewhere where I can go and I could feel good and feel meaningful.
Yeah, that's a very great way to end this segment. I think that's a positive note as people are looking for meaning and purpose in their life. And it seems like, and another sentiment is the pendulum always swings.
Yes.
And as you swing to one side, you'll notice a swing back. And I think that's what we're witnessing. But thank you for those words. I hope that can be an encouragement for some people if they're looking for meaning or purpose in their life. But Elie, thank you so much for joining me today. Appreciate your time.
My pleasure, David.
Those are some interesting insights, being able to look and look at the numbers as to what's been happening in the shift of a young generation and why they're moving towards conservatism. I'm going to be joined again right away here by a friend of ours, Professor David Haskell out of Wilfrid Laurier University in Eastern Canada. And we're going to be looking at a little bit of the trends. We're going to probably look a bit more 10,000 feet in the sense of what is causing people to move towards conservatism. We're going to be looking at a a recent poll, a recent study, I should say, that has come out of the UK that's analyzed young people and how they have been, specifically young men that are finding church, they're finding religion, and how it used to be a stat that religion and church was dying, but now you're seeing a resurgence in this area up to 4 times in this young demographic of 18 to 24-year-olds. So we're going to be joined by Professor David Haskell here in just a moment after this break. Well, welcome back to Merit Watch tonight. I am joined by a great friend of mine, Professor David Haskell out of Eastern Canada. David, in the Greater Toronto area. Great to see you again. Thanks for joining me tonight.
It's a real pleasure. Thanks, David.
Want to pick your brain because you are, first off, just for our audience, if they don't know who you are, is that we've gotten to know each other over the last several years. I've really grown to respect and love your insights and opinions because you're a man that loves to research, find out what is the data behind trends, what is happening. And in this particular case, there's an interesting study that's come out recently out of the UK, which tends to talk about the rise of conservatism, but specifically the rise of church attendance when it comes to young men. Can you maybe just fill us in a little bit? What is this showing? What does the survey show us?
Yeah, well, this is really unique. It came out of the UK, as you said. It was done by the UK Bible Society, and they had really generous samples. So I'm a sociologist of religion. I mean, that's what I do as my day job.
Yeah.
And I like to see things that are big samples. So they're comparing data from 2018 to 2024. Now, the 2018 sample had nearly 20,000 people in it, and then the one from 2024 had just shy of 15,000. So this is a really great sample.
Yeah.
And the thing that really stood out to me was that in terms of church attendance, young men ages 18 to 24, they enjoyed a 5-fold increase, which is a way of saying an over 400% increase in church attendance. Now, I dug into the numbers a bit, and this is even more incredible because a lot of these, well, the vast majority were native UK residents. It wasn't just immigrants. Often we see that immigrants are more religious, and you'd say, well, maybe it's immigration driving this. But no, like this was a significant increase. So we looked at, it's actually an increase from 4% back in 2018 to 21% regular church attendance in the UK among young men.
Wow. See, that's a very interesting stat because we've been hearing as well about the trend of the lack of church attendance and how churches are dying and people are departing from the various faiths, and specifically you're talking about the Christian faith. And I can even recognize that a little bit in terms of what we've been seeing here in Canada and the I would say the young men that are reaching out to us in the programming that we're doing that might lean towards this idea of conservatism, which obviously is one of the fundamental, having a faith and having a religion being a part of. Can you talk to us a little bit about what that means, maybe in terms of a trend when it comes to this idea? Because in Canada, we've got obviously several parties, but you've got a couple different political philosophies or ideologies. But the Conservative Party is based on conservatism, and there's arguments about how conservative are they. What can we learn from this study in terms of the rise of a younger generation? And one more thing to add, we also saw a bit of disparity between demographics in Canada and how they voted between boomer generation and also younger generation. Maybe give us some insights onto what we can learn from that.
Okay, there's a lot there, but I get where you want to go with this.
Yeah.
The one thing that I would say is we need to take a lesson from what's happening in the UK, that the churches that are growing, the churches that are experiencing this phenomenal growth of young men are the most conservative.
Okay.
And by that, I mean theologically conservative.
Okay.
They are not shying away from cultural issues. Now, in fact, people who have been commenting on this in the UK from the left have been saying this is a dangerous movement. These church-going young men are dangerous. They're going to be misogynist. They're going to be homophobic. Because as you know, traditional Christianity does treasure traditional marriage. It does treasure traditional gender roles. And so these left-leaning commentators are saying this is really dangerous. But what someone who's a conservative would look at, they'd say, wait a minute, so you're telling me that the more I talk about really hardcore conservative issues, the better I'll do? And the study seems to be showing just that.
Do you think when it comes, some people are criticizing Pierre Poilievre and the leader of the Conservatives for maybe having a too wide of a tent in terms of what they were trying to approach. And do you think that this was the season that Pierre Poilievre could have played a lot stronger to that conservative base and seen success? Or do you think that was a miscalculation on their part?
So in Canada, it's a bit different. We have overall a different political mix. So
Yes.
I'm not going to try and play armchair quarterback and make a prediction or forecast the past.
Yeah.
But what I can say is this. Increasingly, we're seeing that the younger generation is very primed for a conservative message. And in the future, therefore, not talking about the election that just passed, in the future, if you're a conservative politician, you need to know that the younger generation, especially the native-born younger generation, is really interested, especially the men, in something that is hardcore conservative. And I can even tell you where this is coming from.
Yeah.
They've looked around. These guys lived through COVID. And they've looked around and they said, why has everything gone to crap? They do. And they look at the protests, and they look at the societal degradation, that you're not supposed to be proud to be Canadian. And they say, has it ever not been like this? And then they talk to their folks, or they talk to their grandparents, and the grandparents say, yeah, it wasn't like that when I was around. And then they begin to make the equation. They say, well, what's the difference? And they say, perhaps the goodness actually came from some kind of ideology.
Okay.
And then if they dig deep enough, they find out it's not just an ideology, it's a relationship. It's a relationship with Christ. It's Christianity. And we see this now from historians like Tom Holland, who wrote a book that tied pretty much all the good things that you like about Western society to Christianity. Elie, she has converted to Christianity. We got Russell Brand. We got Jordan Peterson, even though he won't really claim Christianity as his faith. He admits, without Christianity, the West is doomed. So they hear all those things and they say, maybe I should check it out too. And then when they do, they don't want the weak stuff. They want full strength.
Can you give us a quick definition when you use the term conservatism or even hardcore conservatism? I know there's a lot of people might not know what that means in the political ideological sense. Can you define what that means, conservatism, in the lane that you're talking?
Well, so there are numerous factors that would go into what traditional conservatism is. It would have an emphasis on faith primarily. Yeah. And that is really core to conservatism, because most of the other ideas that generate from traditional conservatism come from Christianity. So faith is at the center, and it's not downplayed. It's not removed from the public sphere. It's actually celebrated in the public sphere. But then from faith, you have a reverence for family and policies that will build on family, as well as the primacy of family. Parents' rights take precedent over state rights. You also see freedom. A lot of people don't realize that the ideas surrounding liberty are actually related directly to the Christian faith, which insists on the autonomy of the individual able to make choices. You also have free markets there. That stems from the Christian idea that people should have private property and the ability to make a living. So all those things, which we would, at one time we called common sense, are actually traditional conservatism.
How would that be, just for definitions purposes, when you look at something like classic liberalism, which might have its stem that have certain proponents of freedom of speech and autonomy of the individual, etc. How is that different from, because I know liberalism now has obviously shifted. I'm talking about classic liberalism like JFK, 60s. How would that be different from conservatism? Where would they differ?
That's a great question, because you need to know the difference, right?
Yeah.
A lot, and both are ideologies of the right, both are political philosophies. The difference is that classical liberalism is a reduced form of political philosophy, focusing mostly on free markets and on personal liberty. But it cuts itself free of any kind of morality.
I see.
So conservatism says, in fact, there is an absolute right and wrong, and we have to move toward that. Classical liberalism will say, well, as long as you aren't hurting anybody else, then it's a free-for-all. But under classical liberalism, you get drug laws that see drug addicts using drugs outside of a school. Because are they really hurting anybody? You could have a man in a woman's change room because is he really hurting anybody physically? But the conservative would say, wait a minute, there are particular immutable laws related to the vulnerable that we need to protect them above others. And so classical liberalism is the moral drift. And with traditional conservatism, you have a moral foundation.
Well, that gives some insight as to why you see this idea of liberalism and people involved have shifted so much over the years, as a sense it might not have an anchor that you're saying that conservatism does when it comes to this faith being a foundation or having an absolute anchor that morality is based off of. So I think that's really important to understand, because in the situation in the world that we live in, a lot of terms are not interchangeable, but they're used in a wide variety, and people might have different angles and views. And it's very important, especially when you have political parties that are named after certain political philosophies and where they stem from. But anyways, David, just want to say thank you for the clarity on that. I know we're running short of time here. We got to get the break right away. But again, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Welcome back to Merit Watch tonight. Really interesting to see and to analyze this shift. And it's really an interesting thing to look at, that in a world where progressivism has been dominating institutions, conservatism has actually become the new counter culture. It's almost like that rock star rebellion type of thing I think we're seeing in this younger generation that's got this rebellious attitude, this edginess, and this free thinking idea. And one thing we've been seeing throughout culture, throughout our economy here in Canada, is that you're really seeing a backlash to woke politics. I think many Gen Zers see progressive ideologies as overreaching too far into their lives, where there's a prioritization of censorship, there's a prioritization of cancel culture and identity politics over merit and freedom. And this is something you're seeing a young generation reject. There's also an economic reality check, I think, that is coming here, where you have young people that are not seeing a potential future that they want to see. And young adults are facing problems like inflation, unaffordable housing, and massive debts and student debt. And they're realizing that big government is not delivering. It is not doing the things that maybe a lot of people are hoping for. I think also looking and coming out of things like COVID and riots that seem to have come up in North America, and political upheaval, as well as you're seeing this type of thing, that there's now an increased craving for tradition, for personal responsibility, for order, for things that you can actually earn on your own, which is a true meritocracy. And I think those are all things that are contributing to this resurgence of conservatism in a young people, in a young generation. Very interesting to watch as this trend continues to go forward. But, we're going to keep analyzing this as we keep going. Hope you enjoyed your long weekend. We'll see you back here tomorrow on Merit Watch tonight.